Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in a new tomb he had cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and departed.
If there's one thing science can't handle, it's an enigma that resists known explanations. And the Shroud of Turin, ever since it entered the radar of modern research in 1898, has never ceased to provoke this concern. Now, with the revelation of three-dimensionality by artificial intelligence, the pressure has increased. We cannot afford to simply say it's a miracle and close the loop. French physicist Jean-Paul Mercier stated at a conference, "Science exists precisely to formulate hypotheses, test limits, and confront paradoxes. The shroud is, perhaps, the ultimate paradox." In the decades following the first photograph of the shroud, a series of studies sought to understand how the image of a human body could be printed with such precision on linen fabric. Tests with ultraviolet radiation, chemical reactions, ammonia vapors, and even electrical discharges were performed, but none of the results faithfully reproduced the optical properties of the original. The surface texture of the image, restricted to the outermost layer of fibers with no pigment penetration, remains one of the greatest enigmas of the research. What is known is that the observed pattern does not fit with the artistic or printing techniques known from the medieval period, challenging the hypothesis of forgery. In the decades following the advancement of digital technologies, new studies have begun analyzing the shroud using high-resolution tools and three-dimensional modeling. Artificial intelligence, by processing millions of data points on light and density variations, has revealed a spatial coherence that suggests a real anatomical correspondence, not just pictorial ones. These discoveries have reignited the debate. Some see the cloth as a testament to a still understood physical event. Others, a symbolic construction that spans centuries. What is certain is that more than 700 years after its documented appearance, the Shroud of Turin continues to challenge the boundaries between what science can measure and what history still cannot explain.
The classic explanation, defended by many historians, is that the shroud was a forgery produced between the 13th and 14th centuries. This theory gained traction in 1988 when 3 independent laboratories performed carbon-14 dating tests on samples of the cloth. The result? Between 1260 and 1390 AD. At the time, the report was considered nearly definitive, but disputes soon arose. The samples analyzed were likely taken from areas mended after the 1532 fire, which could have contaminated the results. Furthermore, other chemical studies suggested that the original fiber could have undergone alterations over the centuries, interfering with the carbon-14 dating. Still, for many scholars, the medieval chronology remains plausible. 14th century Europe was rife with fake relics, said British historian Richard Holmes. It's no surprise that someone would produce such a sophisticated work to attract pilgrims and donations. But the argument encounters a stumbling block. How could a medieval forger have managed to print such a subtle image, with three-dimensional data that only now, centuries later, have we been able to detect? The question divides experts and remains unanswered. No known artistic technique from the Middle Ages, neither painting, nor decals, nor metal heating, has been able to reproduce the shroud's optical characteristics. Experiments with pigments, powders, and organic substances have failed to create such a superficial and homogeneous mark, visible only by the variation in tone in the fibers. For scientists studying the phenomenon, the absence of traces of ink, dyes, or organic compounds reinforces the idea that the image was not painted but formed by a still unknown physical or chemical process. Another factor challenging the forgery theory is the figure's anatomical realism. The body's proportions, blood distribution, and correspondence with wounds consistent with crucifixion have been analyzed by coroners and forensic pathologists. Many consider it unlikely that a 14th century artist would have access to this level of anatomical knowledge, and even less likely that he would apply it with such precision. This combination of factors fuels an intermediate hypothesis that the shroud could be authentic to the period and the body depicted, but that the mechanism of image formation, natural or not, remains beyond our understanding. Thus, modern investigation continues, oscillating between historical skepticism and scientific perplexity, two forces that, in the case of the shroud, seem doomed to coexist.
Some experts suggest that the shroud may have been created using advanced artistic techniques, perhaps even precursors to photography. In 2009, Italian chemist Luigi Garlascelli managed to reproduce a similar image using pigments and artificial aging processes. "It's not impossible," he declared. "A talented medieval artist could have produced something very close." But even he acknowledged its limitations. His reproduction was visually similar, but lacked the richness of microscopic detail and three-dimensionality revealed by AI. Others have hypothesized that it could have been made using some kind of contact technique, a kind of chemically treated, tracing a real human body. This hypothesis, however, raises ethical and practical questions. Who would have had access to cadavers, and why go to the trouble of creating such a unique relic instead of simply painting it or sculpting it? Furthermore, analyses by art historians indicate that no known work from the period exhibits characteristics similar to those of the shroud. Even in the most sophisticated religious representations of the 14th century, the figures of the crucified Christ maintain stylized features, far removed from the anatomical naturalism observed in the cloth. The absence of brushstrokes, the uniformity of tone, and the negative inversion of the image, only perceptible in photography, reinforce the idea that, if it was indeed a human creation, it was an extraordinarily far-recognized process outside the artistic standards of the time. Some scholars suggest that the artist may have been a solitary experimenter, someone with rudimentary knowledge of optics and chemistry, far ahead of his time, a finding, however, unsupported by historical records. On the other hand, authenticity advocates argue that no reproduction attempt, however ingenious, has managed to simultaneously capture all of the shroud's physical and chemical properties. The micro-variations in color in the fibers, the thermal pattern, and the absence of distortions in body proportions indicate an origin still unparalleled by known techniques. For them, the shroud transcends the realm of art, becoming a physical document that defies both scientific methods and the limits of historical knowledge. Thus, the artistic hypothesis remains open, not as a definitive answer, but as one of the many attempts to explain an enigma that for over 7 centuries has continued to defy human observation and scientific curiosity.
Researchers have also explored chemical explanations. One is the so-called Maillard reaction, the same process that causes bread to brown in the oven. According to this theory, bodily vapors could have reacted with the linen, producing superficial stains. American biochemist Raymond Rogers, who died in 2005, was one of the proponents of this hypothesis. He argued that compounds released by the decomposing body could have left chemical marks on the fabric.
The problem is that the shroud's image is extremely superficial. It penetrates only a few surface fibers without reaching deeper layers. This detail makes it difficult to explain it by simple vapors. Another controversial point is that the Maillard reaction, while plausible in the laboratory, would require very specific conditions to generate such a detailed image. Temperature, humidity, and exposure time would need to be perfectly balanced, something difficult to achieve naturally, especially in an improvised funerary environment, such as a first-century burial. Furthermore, the sharpness of the contours and the symmetry of the printed body defy the logic of gaseous diffusion. One would expect the vapors to produce fuzzy edges and irregular coloration, which is not observed on the shroud. Critics of this hypothesis argue that the result is too precise to be the result of a purely chemical and random process. Still, the chemical theory hasn't been completely discarded. Some recent studies attempt to reconcile it with low-intensity radiation phenomena, suggesting that the release of energy, perhaps associated with decomposition, perhaps with an as-yet unidentified event, could have intensified the surface reaction in the fibers. This hybrid approach seeks a meeting point between biology, physics, and chemistry, proposing that the shroud is the record of an extremely rare physical event, but not necessarily supernatural. For now, however, each new experiment seems only to deepen the mystery. The more attempts are made to reproduce the image, the more evident it becomes that no single explanation can encompass all its characteristics.
Among the most intriguing theories is that the image was formed by some type of radiation emission. The idea emerged in the 1970s when the Italian physicist Giulio Fanti and colleagues suggested that an intense pulse of ultraviolet light could explain the surface coloration of the fabric. The AI study itself reinforced this line of reasoning, showing that the spectral patterns of the fabric behave like gradations of energy exposure, not like applied pigment. But this hypothesis faces an uncomfortable question. What kind of physical phenomenon in the 1st or 14th century could generate a burst of radiation so intense and controlled that it could record a three-dimensional image without destroying the fabric? To date, no one has been able to reproduce anything similar experimentally. Some experiments have attempted to simulate the effect using excimer lasers and high-power ultraviolet light sources. Although they succeeded in producing a similar surface coloration on linen fabrics, the energy required to cover the entire shroud would be enormous, far greater than any known natural process could release without carbonizing the material. Giulio Fanti and his team calculated that a light pulse lasting a few billionths of a second and with an intensity comparable to that of an atmospheric electrical discharge concentrated in a human body would be required. No documented phenomenon in nature exhibits these characteristics in a controlled manner. Even so, the radiation hypothesis continues to attract attention because, unlike other theories, it simultaneously explains two crucial aspects: the image's extreme superficiality and its three-dimensionality. Some bolder researchers have even suggested that the event that generated the mark could involve an unknown form of energy release, perhaps associated with a biological phenomenon or even a quantum process. While this possibility remains highly speculative, it illustrates how the Shroud of Turin has become a meeting point between cutting-edge science and historical mystery, a material trace that continues to defy not only the instruments but also the imagination of those trying to decipher it.
One detail that has intrigued scientists for decades is the minimal depth of the image. Linen fibers are on average 10 to 15 micrometers in diameter. On the shroud,
The alteration is limited to just a few hundred nanometers on the surface of the fibers. It's as if the color had been blown onto the fiber without penetrating it, explained Spanish engineer Miguel Herrera, a member of the AI study. This level of precision is not compatible with conventional pigments or heat. This detail, combined with the three-dimensionality, forces even the most skeptical to admit, whatever the explanation, we still don't have the technology to accurately replicate what the shroud depicts. Furthermore, the uniformity of the surface alteration adds an extra layer of complexity. There are no signs of brush strokes, rubbing, or irregularities that typically accompany any manual application of color. Each affected fiber maintains a continuous hue, consistent with the exposure intensity of the entire figure, as if each point had been individually recorded by some kind of direct interaction with the body. For Herrera and other researchers, this suggests a formation mechanism radically different from any known chemical, artistic, or thermal process, something that acts at the microscopic level but with macroscopic precision. Another intriguing element is the preservation of the linen. Despite apparent exposure to an intense energetic event, be it radiation, heat, or chemical reaction, the fabric shows no degradation consistent with any pulse strong enough to create the image. This combination of delicacy and definition is unique in the historical record of ancient textiles, making the shroud a unique object of study. With each new analysis, whether through microscopy, spectroscopy, or digital modeling, scientists encounter more questions than answers, reaffirming that even in the 21st century, some relics remain beyond the reach of complete understanding.
There are also those who believe the shroud could be a kind of primitive photograph produced with the help of silver salts and solar exposure. This idea was championed by art historian Nicholas Allen in the 1990s. He showed that, using materials available in the Middle Ages, it would be possible to create negative images similar to those on the shroud. But critics point out flaws. The experimental images required extremely long exposure times, and even then they didn't achieve the same microscopic definition. Furthermore, there is no historical record of photographic techniques being in use at that time. Furthermore, the hypothesis faces another significant technical challenge: the three-dimensionality detected by AI analysis. None of the medieval photography experiments managed to produce intensity variations that correspond to the depth of the body, creating the relief effect that distinguishes the shroud from a simple two-dimensional image. For Nicholas Allen, this doesn't completely invalidate the idea, but it does demonstrate that if some form of proto-photography were used, it would have been produced with knowledge and methods far beyond what is known about medieval science and technology. On the other hand, proponents of the hypothesis argue that future experiments, combining advanced optical techniques and digital simulations, could still reveal methods forgotten or lost over the centuries. However, so far the lack of documentary and experimental evidence leaves medieval photography on par with other theories, intriguing and provocative, but insufficient to fully explain the enigma of the shroud. This possibility, like all others, reinforces the idea that the cloth continues to defy both historical and scientific scrutiny, remaining one of humanity's greatest mysteries.
Another line of investigation is that the shroud may have actually wrapped a human corpse, and the image would have resulted from physical contact, either through bodily fluids or some natural chemical reaction.
This hypothesis is supported by some anthropologists, but faces difficulties. The image does not present the distortions expected from direct contact. It is as if the cloth recorded not only the surface of the body, but also proportional depths, which would only be possible with a three-dimensional projection. Furthermore, the pattern of blood and wound marks reinforces the complexity of the phenomenon. The stains are located with anatomical precision, coinciding with wounds consistent with crucifixion, but without saturating or deforming the fabric, something that would be unlikely if the cloth had simply absorbed fluids from a decomposing body. Forensic experts, such as American pathologist Frederick Zugibe, emphasize that the distribution and shape of the stains require not only anatomical knowledge, but also extraordinarily controlled conditions to remain so clear over centuries. For proponents of this theory, this indicates that the shroud is not just a cloth that touched a body, but a physical record of something more complex, possibly involving as yet unknown chemical or energetic processes. The direct contact hypothesis continues to attract attention because it offers an intuitive explanation for the relationship between cloth and body, but simultaneously exposes the limits of what science can reproduce in the laboratory.
Faced with so many hypotheses, none of them fully convincing, researchers have coined a term, the paradox of impossibility. If the shroud is medieval, it would have been created using techniques centuries beyond known technology. If it is ancient and actually wrapped a body, the formation of the image defies conventional chemical and physical explanations. If it was produced by radiation, we don't know what energy source could produce such a phenomenon without destroying the fabric. It's as if we're looking at an artifact that shouldn't exist, said American anthropologist Susan Kaplan. Either it's a brilliant forgery ahead of its time, or it's something beyond our scientific understanding. The paradox deepens when considering the shroud's microscopic and three-dimensional properties. Each affected fiber exhibits precise surface alterations without penetrating the fabric, while the entire image maintains near-perfect anatomical proportions. No known technique, whether artistic, chemical, or physical, can simultaneously reproduce these characteristics. For many scientists, this transforms the shroud into a test of limits, not only of our technology, but of our ability to understand phenomena that seem to defy established laws. At the same time, the shroud functions as a historical and cultural mirror. It sparks debates that span generations, bringing together physicists, chemists, historians, theologians, and artists around a single enigma. The coexistence of possible and impossible explanations transforms the cloth into a symbol of the limit between human knowledge and mystery. Perhaps it is precisely this dilemma, the tension between explanation and incomprehension, that guarantees the Shroud of Turin its continued relevance, maintaining it not only as an object of study, but as a permanent challenge to scientific curiosity and human imagination.
Despite the uncertainties, the majority of the scientific community remains inclined toward the medieval explanation. The weight of carbon-14 dating, coupled with the historical context of fake relics, supports this position. But even among skeptics, there's a sense of unease. It's easy to say it's a fake, Mercier commented. The hard part is explaining how the fake was made. And so far, no one has managed to do that. A mystery that fuels research. In the end, perhaps, it's precisely this impossibility that keeps the shroud alive as an object of study. If there were a simple explanation, painting, early photography, a chemical reaction, interest would have waned. But each new analysis, each new technology seems only to deepen the mystery. Now, with artificial intelligence revealing three-dimensional details, the challenge has become even greater. It's as if the shroud were a mirror of science, Rossi concluded. The further we advance, the more it shows us what we don't yet know.